And today, we have a very specific, slightly unusual mission for this deep dive.
I'm ready for it.
We are completely, entirely skipping the plot of this movie.
Which is honestly incredibly refreshing. I mean, we all know the story of the babysitter and the boogeyman, right?
Right,
It
yeah.
is practically baked into our cultural DNA at this point.
The guy in the mask stalks the teenagers. We get it. The plot is honestly the least interesting thing about the film. Instead, we were looking under the hood today.
Love that.
Our mission is to explore the fascinating, almost unbelievable mechanics behind how this hyper-budget independent experiment became one of the most profitable movies of all time.
Because it really functions as the ultimate masterclass in constraint.
Yes. We are going to dissect the specific psychological tricks the director used to bypass logic and induce absolute terror. And we're going to look at the surprising cultural anxieties it accidentally captured along the way.
We're going to see how absolute limitations like having no time, no money, and no prestige actually force a kind of ruthless, razor-sharp creativity. A creativity that limitless budgets often just, completely destroy.
Exactly. So whether you are a fanatic who watches this movie every October without fail, or you're just someone fascinated by how massive success can be born out of extreme limitations, you are in the right place.
It's going to be a fun one.
We are talking about doing more with less on a level that honestly feels like magic. So let's jump in. The spark for this entire empire starts with two guys looking to make a buck.
Right, an independent producer named Erwin Yablans and a financier named Mustafa Akkad.
And their ambition was just staggering, especially given their resources. They had this very basic, almost crude concept, right?
Yeah, just a psychotic killer stalking babysitters. Very simple.
But Yablans wasn't just looking to make a quick, cheap drive-in movie that would play for 2 weeks and disappear.
No, not at all. He explicitly stated in an interview with Fangoria magazine years later that his goal was to make a picture that had the exact same cultural impact as The Exorcist.
This is a completely wild comparison.
Oh, it's absurd.
Right. The Exorcist was this massive, studio-backed prestige picture. It was directed by William Friedkin. It had a massive budget. It dealt with heavy theological themes.
And it famously had people literally fainting in the aisle.
Yes, fainting. And Yablans wants to replicate that global hysteria with a movie about dead babysitters.
Well, to pull off that kind of atmospheric dread, they knew they needed a director who really understood tension.
Which makes sense.
Right. They had recently attended the Milan Film Festival and caught a screening of a 1976 action thriller called Assault on Precinct 13.
Oh, John Carpenter's film.
Exactly. It was directed by John Carpenter. They were incredibly impressed by how much suspense Carpenter wrung out of a tiny budget in that film. So they approach him.
And Carpenter agrees to take on this babysitter murders project, but he issues a very specific ironclad condition before he signs anything.
He demanded absolute creative control, final cut.
Which, I mean, for a young, relatively untested director at the time, is an enormous demand. Studios guard the final edit with their lives.
They do, but Carpenter essentially bought that final cut by agreeing to work for absolute peanuts.
Wait, how much did he actually get paid?
He was paid a grand total of $10,000 for his work on this film. And it is vital to understand that this $10,000 wasn't just his directing fee.
You're kidding?
Nope. That flat rate covered writing the screenplay, directing the film, and composing the entire musical score.
$10,000. Even if we adjust that for inflation, which our sources put at roughly $49,000 today, that is functionally nothing.
It's unbelievable.
He is wearing 3 of the most important hats on a major production for the salary of an entry-level assistant.
He did manage to negotiate a back-end deal, though, securing rights to 10% of the film's profits.
Okay, well, that gamble obviously turned out to be one of the smartest financial decisions in Hollywood history.
Oh, absolutely. But up front, it was entirely a labor of love, driven by his desire for total creative autonomy.
And because time was money they didn't have, the speed of production was just blistering. Carpenter and his then-girlfriend, producer Debra Hill, sat down and wrote the entire screenplay in approximately 10 days.
Which is just, it's so fast.
Let's just pause on that.
Yeah.
10 days. Most Hollywood scripts go through months, sometimes years, of outlining, drafting, and endless revisions.
Oh, yeah. Development hell is real.
I've had emails languishing in my drafts folder longer than it took them to invent the modern slasher genre. But the sheer speed of that writing process actually brings up a rather controversial piece of horror history.
It does, yes.
There's a very interesting situation with another director, Bob Clark.
This is a vital piece of context. So in 1974, Bob Clark directed a phenomenal, deeply unsettling film called Black Christmas.
Right, which is fantastic, by the way.
It really is. It is essentially a proto-slasher. It features a faceless, mysterious killer terrorizing a sorority house during the holidays. It relies heavily on subjective camera angles and chilling, heavy-breathing phone calls.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the DNA is already looking remarkably familiar here. A holiday setting, a faceless killer, targeted young women.
Oh, it goes deeper than that. According to an interview Bob Clark gave in 2005, he and Carpenter actually crossed paths and worked together on an unproduced project a few years after Black Christmas came out.
Oh, wow. I didn't know they actually worked together.
Yeah, and during their conversations, Carpenter asked Clark if he ever planned to direct a sequel to Black Christmas. Clark replied that he was finished with horror. He had no interest in a sequel.
But Carpenter pressed him, didn't he?
He did. He asked, well, hypothetically, what would you do if you were going to make a sequel?
You can almost hear the gears turning in Carpenter's head. What was Clark's hypothetical pitch?
Clark told him that his idea was that the killer from the first movie, who famously escapes capture at the end of Black Christmas, is eventually caught.
Okay, so he's institutionalized.
Right, placed in a mental institution and then escapes the following year. He goes back to the town and starts the cycle all over again.
Wow.
And Clark specifically noted in this interview that his title for this hypothetical sequel was Halloween.
Okay, wait. Escaped mental patient. Returning to a specific suburban location to kill again. Literally titled Halloween. I have to play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
Did John Carpenter just outright steal the blueprint for this massive franchise from Bob Clark? Because that doesn't just sound like inspiration, that sounds like a direct photocopy of the premise.
It's really easy to jump to that conclusion, but the reality is much more nuanced, and Bob Clark himself was incredibly gracious about how it all went down.
Really? How so?
Well, in that exact same 2005 interview, Clark went out of his way to clear the air. He explicitly stated, the truth is, John didn't copy Black Christmas. He wrote a script, directed the script, did the casting. Halloween is his movie.
That's a very generous way to look at it. I mean, but what about the title? That's a pretty big coincidence.
Clark clarified that piece of the puzzle, too. He noted that the project was originally pitched to Carpenter by Irwin Yablans, and Yablans had already attached the title Halloween to the concept of the babysitter murders.
Wow.
Yeah. Clark summarized it by saying that Carpenter certainly liked Black Christmas and was likely influenced by its atmospheric dread, but he emphatically pushed back on the idea of outright theft.
So it's less about corporate espionage and more akin to, like, how folklore works. Ideas and tropes are passed around campfires, they mutate, they get refined by different storytellers.
Exactly.
It's like Clark handed Carpenter a rough seed, and Carpenter took it, combined it with Yablan's title, and planted it in entirely different soil to see what would grow.
Folklore is the perfect term for it.
Oh, yeah.
And the specific soil they chose to plant this idea in was actually rooted in ancient primal mythology.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
It really is. Debra Hill spoke extensively about how they struggled in those early days of the 10-day writing sprint. They had the title and they had the concept of a killer, but they needed a philosophical engine to make it actually scary.
Right, because how do you elevate a guy with a knife into something that feels mythic?
Exactly. To find the answer, they dug into Celtic traditions, specifically the ancient festival of Samhain.
The pagan harvest festival. The foundational idea that the end of October is a liminal space, a night when the veil between the living and the dead is at its absolute thinnest, allowing dark spirits to cross over and wreak havoc on the living.
Precisely. Hill explained that the core realization they had was the concept that you simply cannot kill evil. It is a force of nature.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, that became the philosophical underpinning of the entire script. The antagonist wasn't just a disgruntled guy holding a grudge. It was the ancient, unstoppable concept of pure evil, abruptly dropped into the absolute most mundane, recognizable setting imaginable.
And they really leaned into that mundane aspect, didn't they? They grounded the mythic evil by making the setting incredibly personal.
They essentially mapped their own childhoods onto the fictional town. The movie takes place in Haddonfield, Illinois, but that name was lifted directly from Haddonfield, New Jersey.
Which is where Debra Hill grew up, right?
Exactly.
And the streets that Michael Myers stalks. The physical geography of the town. So those street names are pulled directly from Bowling Green, Kentucky, which is John Carpenter's hometown.
It's all so close to home.
Literally. They literally paved this nightmare with their own memories.
They even infused the character names with layers of cinematic history and personal homage. Laurie Strode, the protagonist, was allegedly named after an ex-girlfriend of Carpenter's.
Which is kind of funny.
But the deeper you look, the more it reads like a love letter to Alfred Hitchcock. The young boy that Laurie is babysitting on Halloween night is named Tommy Doyle. That is a direct nod to Wendell Corey's detective character in Hitchcock's masterpiece, Rear Window.
And then there's the psychiatrist who spends the whole movie frantically chasing Michael Myers, trying to warn everyone. Dr. Sam Loomis.
Also a Hitchcock homage.
Yep.
Named after John Gavin's character in Psycho. And the brilliant metatextual layer there is that the Sam Loomis of Psycho was the boyfriend of Marion Crane.
Who was famously played by Janet Leigh.
Yes.
Who, of course, just happens to be the real-life mother of Jamie Lee Curtis, the star of Halloween.
It's amazing.
The casting weaves this massive, tangled web of horror royalty. It is so referential, but it never tips over into parody. It feels like they are intentionally building a new modern mythology directly on the bedrock of the classics.
Absolutely.
They even named the killer, Michael Myers, after the European distributor who had championed Carpenter's previous film overseas.
That is true. It's a rather dark way to show gratitude, honestly.
Very.
Naming the soulless embodiment of pure evil after your colleague. But it shows how insular and resourceful they were being. They had this script, deeply personal, rooted in ancient Celtic lore, heavily referencing Hitchcock, all written in a week and a half.
But words on a page are cheap.
Yes, they are.
Turning those words into a visual reality brings us to the harsh reality of their budget. $300,000 is not just low. It dictates the entire aesthetic of the film.
You cannot overstate the extreme penny pinching happening here. Every single decision had to be ruthlessly efficient. Let's look at how the budget completely dictated the casting process.
Okay, let's do it.
Carpenter knew that because the cast was mostly young, unknown teenagers, he desperately needed a veteran actor to anchor the film.
Right, someone to give the lore some theatrical gravity.
Exactly. The role of Dr. Loomis was crucial. They originally took the script to Peter Cushing.
Oh man, that would have been incredible. Cushing had that intense aristocratic authority. He was just coming off playing Grand Moff Tarkin in Star Wars. He was a massive star.
And his agent rejected the offer immediately.
Ouch.
The salary was simply too insulting to even consider. So they moved down their wish list and approached Christopher Lee, the definitive cinematic Dracula. He also turns it down flat for the exact same reason.
Which is funny in retrospect, considering what a juggernaut the film became. I assume Christopher Lee didn't look back on that decision fondly.
He certainly didn't. Years later, he actually told Carpenter and Hill in person that declining the role of Dr. Loomis was the single biggest regret of his entire career.
Wow, the biggest regret.
Yeah, but those rejections are what led them to Donald Pleasence.
Who ends up giving a completely unhinged, legendary performance? How much did they manage to scrape together to get him?
Donald Pleasence was the highest paid actor on the entire production, and he received a flat fee of $20,000.
Okay, well, that's double Carpenter's pay.
True, but what's fascinating is why he took the role. It wasn't because he believed in the script or thought it was a masterpiece. He took the job entirely because his daughter, Lucy, was a guitarist, and she absolutely loved the synth-heavy musical score Carpenter had composed for Assault on Precinct 13.
That is phenomenal. He took a defining career role for cool points with his teenage daughter.
Pretty much.
Sure, I'll go run around the suburbs chasing the guy in a mask. My kid thinks the director's band is neat. And then, of course, you have Jamie Lee Curtis stepping into the role of Laurie Strode. This was her feature film debut.
She was paid $8,000 for the entire shoot.
$8,000.
Yeah. And Carpenter freely admitted that when her name was brought up, he had no idea who she was.
Yeah.
He wasn't watching the television shows she had done minor guest spots on. She was only 19 years old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Carpenter's initial choice for the role was actually an actress named Anne Lockhart, but she was unavailable.
But Debra Hill, being a savvy producer, she immediately saw the marketing goldmine in casting Curtis, right?
Absolutely. Hill understood the PR mechanics of Hollywood. She knew that casting the actual daughter of Janet Leigh, the woman whose shower scene in Psycho defined horror for a generation, would provide free, irresistible marketing for their tiny independent film.
It's just brilliant producing.
Interestingly, though, Jamie Lee Curtis herself had deep reservations about playing Laurie.
Really? Why?
Well, she viewed herself as a very outgoing, confident cheerleader type. She thought she was much better suited to play one of the louder, more obnoxious friends who gets killed off early rather than the quiet, repressed intellectual protagonist.
But again, this goes back to our central thesis, right? Constraint breeds creativity. They couldn't afford a massive marquee star for the lead, so they get Pleasance doing it as a favor to his kid, and they land a legacy casting in Curtis that turns out to be absolute lightning in a bottle.
Perfectly said.
But if we want to talk about the ultimate undeniable proof of budget constraints creating iconic art, we have to talk about The Mask.
Oh, The Mask. The Mask is arguably the single greatest return on investment in the history of visual arts.
Okay, so the script just calls for the killer to have the pale features of a human face. They don't have the budget to hire a Hollywood special effects studio to sculpt custom prosthetics and do life casts.
Not at all.
Here, they have essentially no money. So Tommy Lee Wallace, who is the production designer and art director, and who is also doing location scouting and co-editing because everyone's working 5 jobs on this set, he just walks down Hollywood Boulevard to a standard magic and costume shop.
He browses the shelves and purchases a commercial Don Post Studios mask, specifically a mask of Captain James T. Kirk from Star Trek.
William Shatner's face.
William Shatner's face. And the total cost, $1.98.
$2.
Yeah.
You cannot buy a pack of gum for $2 today.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this process, and the only way I can describe it is as a reverse pop art experiment.
Ooh, I like that. How do you mean?
Well, think about what Andy Warhol did in the 1960s. He would take a recognizable, ubiquitous pop culture item, a Campbell's soup can, or the face of Marilyn Monroe, and he would replicate it, colorize it, and elevate it to make a statement about mass consumption.
Right.
Tommy Lee Wallace did the exact inverse. He took one of the most recognizable, heroic, optimistic pop culture icons of the decade, the captain of the Enterprise, and he systematically bleached the humanity right out of it.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it, because he didn't just paint it, he fundamentally altered its architecture.
He physically changed it.
Right. He took scissors and widened the eye holes to remove any trace of a human gaze. He ripped off the sideburns in the hair. He took a can of bluish-white spray paint and covered the flesh tones.
It's so creepy.
He took a face that was culturally synonymous with human exploration, empathy, and triumph, and he mutated it into a void of pure apathy.
And the funniest footnote to all of this is that William Shatner himself had absolutely no idea his face was the centerpiece of a horror franchise for years.
It's hilarious.
Our sources note an interview where Shatner was finally asked about it, and his immediate, genuine reaction was, "Is that a joke? It sounds like an urban legend."
But the reason it works so well isn't just because it's a fun piece of trivia. There is a deep psychological genius to that specific blankness.
Tell me more about that.
Well, Debra Hill noted that their primary goal was to make the killer entirely humorless and faceless. By eradicating William Shatner's features, they essentially created a blank cinematic canvas.
Think about what that actually does to a viewer. If a killer is wearing a scowling mask or a monster mask with fangs, your brain immediately categorizes the threat.
Exactly.
You know what it is? It's angry. It's a monster. Anger is a human emotion that has a cause and an effect. But a blank slate offers zero information.
Precisely. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the human mind abhors a lack of context. When confronted with that blank, featureless white visage, the audience's subconscious is forced into overdrive.
Right. Trying to make sense of it.
Yes. They are projecting their own deepest, most personal fears onto the mask. It's why he isn't even billed as Michael Myers in the original credits. He is billed simply as the Shape.
The Shape, it's so eerie.
He isn't a human being. He is an empty vessel waiting to be filled with your specific terror. John Carpenter later pointed out that if they hadn't spray painted the mask white, it wouldn't have been scary at all. Kids would have just been checking their closets at night, worried that William Shatner was going to attack them.
That's a very different movie.
The paint removed the identity and left behind only the dread.
And the man tasked with bringing that dread to life under the mask was Nick Castle. He wasn't a stuntman or an imposing bodybuilder. He was just an old friend of Carpenter's from their film school days at USC.
Just a guy hanging around.
Yeah, he was hanging around the set. And Carpenter offered him $25 a day to put on the coveralls. $25 a day to play arguably the most recognizable slasher in cinema history.
The logistical realities of the shoot are almost charmingly desperate. Because there was no wardrobe budget, the actors mostly wore their own personal clothing.
Which is wild for a major motion picture.
Jamie Lee Curtis had to go to a local JCPenney and spent roughly $100 out of her own pocket to buy Laurie Strode's entire wardrobe.
And we haven't even mentioned the weather.
Yeah.
They are shooting a movie titled Halloween, a movie deeply dependent on the aesthetic of late October in the American Midwest. But they were filming it in Southern California in May.
Which is a logistical nightmare for a production designer with no money. The trees are green. The weather is warm. To sell the illusion of autumn, they had to purchase bags of artificial, painted fall leaves.
But they couldn't afford enough to cover a whole neighborhood, could they?
No, not at all. So they would painstakingly scatter a handful of these fake leaves on a sidewalk, film the actors walking past them, and as soon as Carpenter yelled cut, the crew would literally run out with rakes, sweep up the fake leaves, put them back in the bag, and carry them to the next shooting location.
A traveling bag of autumn. So scrappy. And they couldn't even find real pumpkins to carve into jack-o'-lanterns because pumpkins don't grow in the spring. They had to fake the entire season.
Exactly.
Look at the car Michael Myers drives. The iconic station wagon he steals from the sanitarium. That wasn't a studio prop car maintained by a transportation department. It was a standard 1978 Ford LTD station wagon that they managed to rent from an Illinois government agency for a measly 2 weeks.
And the postscript on that vehicle is one for the history books. After the 2-week rental was up, they returned it.
Gave it back.
Yeah, and the agency eventually auctioned it off to the public. The buyer drove it for a while, parked it in a barn, and it sat there rotting for decades. Only recently did a collector discover it, buy it, and painstakingly restore it. The ultimate terrifying artifact of cinema history, just collecting dust under a tarp in a barn.
It's incredible. The whole production is held together with duct tape, favors, and fake leaves. But here's the critical turning point of our story. They finish the shoot. They get the footage in the can.
The hardest part is done, theoretically.
Right. They take this deeply personal script, the reverse pop art mask, the legacy casting, and they edit together a rough cut to show a studio executive. And it totally bombs. It falls completely flat. The executive watches it and tells Carpenter point blank that the movie simply isn't scary.
That is the most terrifying moment in a filmmaker's career. You have stretched every dollar, you have executed your vision perfectly, but the visceral reaction, the actual fear, just isn't translating to the screen.
Yeah, the pacing felt slow. The tension was flat.
So Carpenter is looking at a massive failure. He has a silent killer who shows no emotion, walking around the sunny suburbs. He realizes the movie is completely missing its soul.
And that means he has to inject one. Which brings us to the single most vital element of the film's success, the music.
Carpenter knew that if the visual tension wasn't working on its own, he had to manipulate the audience through their ears. And this is where his initial demand for absolute creative control paid massive dividends.
Definitely.
Instead of hiring an outside composer who might not understand the tone, he decided to score the film himself.
Which was incredibly risky. Put this into the context of 1970s horror. When you think of a scary movie from that era, you think of massive, sweeping, terrifying orchestral arrangements. You think of John Williams creating symphonic terror with brass and strings for Jaws just a few years prior.
But Carpenter didn't have the budget for a 100-piece orchestra. And more importantly, he lacked the formal technical training to even write for one.
Really?
Yeah, he famously admitted in interviews, "I can play just about any keyboard you put in front of me, but I cannot read or write a single note of sheet music."
So what is his solution? He sits down in a studio with a synthesizer and a piano, and in 3 days, just 3 days of improvisation and recording, he bangs out the entire iconic score. And it is a masterpiece of psychological manipulation.
The technical structure he chose for the main theme is where the genius lies. He avoided standard musical timing and instead utilized a highly complex 54-time signature.
Wait, let's break that down without getting too bogged down in music theory. What does 54 time actually mean for the listener's brain?
Sure. So the vast majority of popular music, from rock to pop to folk, is written in 44 time. It is a symmetrical, predictable rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Right.
Your brain fundamentally understands the pattern. It knows exactly when the next beat is going to arrive. It is a safe, comfortable sonic environment.
But 54 time throws a wrench in that prediction engine. It adds an extra beat, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It feels inherently asymmetrical.
Yes, exactly.
It feels off balance. It mimics the rapid, uneven palpitation of a panicked heartbeat.
Exactly. Before Michael Myers ever raises a knife, that 54-time signature is bypassing your logic and directly communicating with your central nervous system.
That's brilliant.
It creates a subconscious biological anxiety because your brain cannot comfortably predict the rhythm. Carpenter worked with a music professor from San Jose State University named Dan Wyman to help program the synthesizers and get it recorded cleanly.
And as a final inside joke, In the end credits, Carpenter billed his one-man synthesizer performance as the Bowling Green Philharmonic Orchestra.
That's a great touch.
Right. And I found myself wondering, while reviewing the sources for this deep dive, if you were to conduct an experiment today where you mute the movie completely, you take out that 54 piano riff, would Halloween hold up as a horror classic? Or is that frantic piano doing the vast majority of the psychological heavy lifting?
That is a brilliant question that cuts to the core of cinematic synthesis. The film critic James Berardinelli reviewed the film and noted that while the score is mathematically relatively simple and unsophisticated, it remains one of the film's absolute strongest assets.
Makes sense.
The music functions as the film's emotional engine, precisely because the visual antagonist provides zero emotional data.
Right. Michael Myers never grunts in anger. He doesn't yell. He doesn't laugh maniacally like a standard villain.
Yeah.
He is a complete void of sound.
If your killer is completely silent and visually emotionless, the sense of dread must be generated by the atmosphere. And Carpenter's specific direction to Nick Castle on set perfectly illustrates this dynamic.
Oh, how so?
Castle approached Carpenter before take and asked the classic actor question, "What is my motivation for this scene?" And Carpenter looked at him and said, "Your motivation is to walk from this piece of tape on the floor to that piece of tape on the floor and do not act."
Do not act. That has to be the most counterintuitive note a director can give. But he wanted a machine, not a man.
The only time Carpenter gave Castle a highly specific behavioral direction was during the infamous murder of the character Bob.
Oh, I know this scene.
Yeah, Michael pins Bob to the wall with a knife, and Carpenter instructed Castle to step back, tilt his head to the side, and simply observe the body. He told him to look at it as if he were examining a new addition to a butterfly collection.
That head tilt is burned into the retinas of anyone who has seen the film. It is so deeply unsettling because it isn't malicious, it isn't angry, it's just clinically curious, like a scientist watching an insect twitch on a pen.
Which answers your question about the music. If you mute the film, that head tilt might just look slightly awkward or confused, but when you pair that clinical alien body language with the frantic, pulsing anxiety of the 54 musical score, the head tilt suddenly becomes the terrifying behavior of an entity that fundamentally does not understand or value human life.
So the music is the heartbeat of the fear. But we also have to look at the eyes of the movie, the camera work. If the music bypasses your brain to make you anxious, the camera is designed to physically implicate you in the violence.
This is where Carpenter's visual ingenuity takes center stage. To achieve the specific look he wanted, he heavily utilized a brand new piece of filming technology called the Panaglide,
which was an early clone of the Steadicam system.
Yeah.
For context, before the late 1970s, directors essentially had two options for moving a camera, right?
Right.
You either bolted the camera to a heavy metal dolly on steel tracks, which gave you smooth movement but was incredibly slow and spatially restricted, or a cameraman held it on his shoulder, which gave you freedom of movement but resulted in shaky, nauseating footage.
The Panaglide revolutionized visual storytelling. It was a harness worn by the operator, equipped with a complex system of gyroscopes and counterweights. It isolated the camera from the operator's physical footsteps.
So it smooths everything out.
Yes. This allowed the camera to float effortlessly through complex environments upstairs, through doorways, around corners, with the smoothness of a dolly, but the freedom of a handheld camera.
It creates a visual sensation that is almost ghostly. It glides.
And Carpenter weaponized that glide to employ extended, unbroken first-person point-of-view shots. From the absolute opening frame of the film, the camera does not just show us the killer. The camera is the killer.
The opening sequence is a masterclass in this. The film critic, Susan Stark, wrote a beautiful analysis of it in 1978. It is a single, seemingly uncut, fluid tracking shot.
It's mesmerizing.
You, the audience, are walking down a quiet suburban street. You stop outside a house, you look through a window and watch as two teenagers make out. You wait for the boyfriend to leave. Then, the camera, which is your perspective, walks around to the back door. A hand reaches into the frame and grabs a massive butcher knife from a kitchen drawer.
And then you go inside.
You walk up the stairs. The camera literally slides behind a clown mask, restricting your peripheral vision.
Yeah.
And then you murder a teenage girl.
It is a deeply transgressive act of filmmaking. As the film historian J.P. Tellot points out, this forced perspective fundamentally alters the viewer's relationship with the violence.
How so?
Well, we're not safely seated in the theater, watching a tragedy unfold from a distance. The camera forces us to participate. It actively implicates the audience in the voyeurism and the murder.
It's an incredibly uncomfortable sensation. You find yourself watching these oblivious suburban kids through the bushes, accompanied by the heavy breathing on the audio track. You feel like a predator.
But Carpenter is smart enough not to rely solely on the gimmick of the POV shot. He masterfully balances that subjective viewpoint with objective framing. Roger Ebert, who was one of the film's biggest early champions, specifically highlighted Carpenter's brilliant use of foregrounding.
Okay, let's unpack that term. How does foregrounding work to build tension?
It's all about how you utilize the depth of the cinematic frame. Standard directing usually places the subject of interest, dead center, in perfect focus.
Right.
Carpenter subverts this. He will have the protagonist, Laurie, perfectly lit and in focus in the deep background of the shot, totally unaware of her surroundings. But the camera focuses on the blurred, dark foreground, the edge of a door frame, or the corner of a room closest to the lens.
And slowly, agonizingly, a shape steps out of the shadows right in front of the camera. The audience sees the lethal danger before the character does.
Exactly.
It generates an unbearable sense of anticipation because you want to scream at the screen to warn them.
And he also manipulates the audience's nervous system by playing with the timing of the violence, using what's called the false startle.
The old tap on the shoulder routine.
Yeah.
Carpenter intentionally delays the actual violence for over an hour of runtime.
Yes.
He builds the tension to a boiling point and then deflates it with a fake out, like a friend jumps out from behind a hedge to say hello or a dog barks suddenly. Your body produces an adrenaline spike, realizes it's safe, and crashes.
He does this repeatedly. So by the time the real violence finally erupts in the third act, the audience's nervous system is already completely exhausted and defenseless.
It is a meticulously designed machine for manipulation. The featureless blank mask, the biologically disruptive 54 music, the floating predatory camera, it's all designed to bypass your intellectual defenses. But paradoxically, because the villain is such a blank slate, it opened the floodgates for academics and theorists to project deep societal meaning onto the film, which takes us into the critical legacy of Halloween and where the movie moves from a simple haunted house ride to a subject of intense cultural debate.
This is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the film's legacy. When an artist creates a void, human nature rushes in to fill it with meaning. And the film scholars certainly showed up to psychoanalyze this void.
Let's talk about Carol J. Clover. She is an absolute giant in the field of film theory. She looked at Halloween and saw something much more profound than a guy with a knife chasing babysitters.
Clover published groundbreaking work in 1987 that fundamentally changed how we analyze horror. She argued that Halloween and the entire slasher genre that it popularized inextricably links sexuality with lethal danger.
Wow.
She posited that these masked killers are not driven by robbery or revenge, but are fueled by a deep psychosexual fury.
Meaning that the physical violence of the knife is a cinematic stand-in for sexual aggression.
Precisely. She pointed out a crucial detail, which is that guns have virtually no place in slasher films. The act of killing is overwhelmingly physical, hands-on, and penetrative.
It involves stabbing, strangling, impaling.
Right. It is deeply intimate. And she noted exactly who the targets of this intimate violence are. The teenagers who are engaging in illicit behavior, drinking alcohol, smoking marijuana, and specifically having premarital sex, are the ones swiftly and brutally punished by the killer.
You see that clearly in the film.
Yeah.
Laurie's friends are treating their babysitting responsibilities as a convenient excuse to invite their boyfriends over and hook up, and every single one of them is slaughtered.
Yep.
But Laurie Strode, who is presented as studious, responsible, and virginal, survives the ordeal.
And this observation led Clover to establish one of the most famous and enduring concepts in cinematic theory, the final girl. If you look at horror films prior to 1978, think of the old Hammer horror Dracula films, or the creature features of the 50s. Women were almost exclusively portrayed as helpless, screaming victims waiting to be rescued by a strong, masculine hero.
That was totally the standard.
Clover argued that Halloween structurally broke that mold. Laurie Strode is the final girl. She doesn't wait for the police or a boyfriend to save her. She's the one who actively fights back.
Right. She weaponizes her domestic environment, stabbing Michael with a knitting needle, a metal wire coat hanger, and eventually his own butcher knife. She ultimately triumphs, or at least survives long enough to force the monster to retreat.
It paints Laurie as a feminist icon of survival. But the flip side of that exact same coin is that many cultural critics viewed the film not as an empowering survival story, but as a deeply conservative, reactionary morality play.
The ultimate purity test.
Yes. The logic is simple. If you do drugs and have sex, you die. If you are a good, pure, obedient virgin, you live. It frames the slasher as the enforcer of traditional moral values.
And that specific interpretation, the idea that they made a conservative morality tale, drove both John Carpenter and Debra Hill absolutely crazy. They vehemently and repeatedly denied that they were trying to make any kind of moralizing statement.
Oh, they hated that theory.
I know Carpenter was pretty aggressive in his pushback. How did he explain Laurie's survival if it wasn't a reward for her purity?
He was incredibly blunt about it. He stated that reading the film as a puritanical morality play completely missed the point. He insisted that the characters were just normal teenagers doing what normal teenagers do.
Yeah, enough.
But his specific psychoanalysis of Laurie Strode is wild. He explicitly argued that Laurie does not survive because she is a virgin. He claimed she survives because she is the most sexually frustrated character in the movie.
I need to pause on that because that is a massive, highly controversial claim from the director.
Sexually frustrated.
Yes. Carpenter's argument was that because Laurie is repressed and not engaging in the sexual release that her friends are, she has built up a massive reservoir of repressed energy.
When she is backed into a corner and attacked, all of that pent-up frustration explodes violently outward. She fights back using, as Carpenter himself explicitly pointed out, phallic symbols, the long, penetrating shape of the knife and the knitting needle. He framed her survival as a violent release of repressed energy, not a karmic reward for being chaste.
That is a fascinating, if somewhat bizarrely Freudian defense from Carpenter. Did Debra Hill share that perspective?
Hill largely dismissed the morality play critique as well, preferring to view it as a simple thriller. However, she did offer an interesting concession.
What was that?
She noted that she was raised as a strict Catholic schoolgirl, and she speculated that perhaps her ingrained Catholic sensibility regarding sin and punishment may have subconsciously leaked into the script without her realizing it.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This brings up a huge philosophical debate. There is a concept in literary and artistic analysis called the death of the author.
Yes, a classic concept.
It essentially argues that once an artist releases their work into the public sphere, their original intentions cease to matter. The creator does not hold a monopoly on the meaning of their art. The audience's interpretation and how the art reflects the culture is the only truth that matters.
Exactly.
If John Carpenter explicitly says, I was not making a moral statement, I just wanted to make a fun haunted house movie, does it matter that a generation of critics and academics decided he actually made a puritanical parable about psychosexual fury?
It absolutely matters because art does not exist in a vacuum. The intentions of the author are only the vehicle that delivers the art into the world. Once it arrives, it functions as a mirror for the anxieties of the culture consuming it.
Right.
Even if Carpenter genuinely didn't intend to make a moralizing statement, the film released in 1978 cleanly tapped into a massive, latent societal anxiety about the sexual revolution, teenage promiscuity, and the perceived breakdown of traditional family morals.
It captured the exact mood of the country.
Yes. The fact that the audience organically read it as a morality play tells us something profound about the cultural temperature of America at that time, completely independent of the director's intent.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. It's like Carpenter was trying to film a simple magic trick, but he accidentally caught a real ghost on camera.
I love that analogy.
And speaking of capturing the zeitgeist, the morality of teenagers wasn't the only anxiety the film tapped into. There is another massive thematic undercurrent here. The utter failure of the suburban dream.
Film scholars, notably Pat Gill, have written extensively on how Halloween functions as a devastating critique of American suburbia.
This taps into the phenomenon of white flight in the mid-20th century, right?
Exactly.
The idea of families fleeing the perceived dirt, crime, and danger of the inner cities and migrating to these pristine, manicured, uniform suburban neighborhoods under the assumption that their children will be perfectly safe behind white picket fences.
Exactly. The parents who moved to Haddonfield believed they had purchased geographical immunity from violence. But the film brutally dissects and mocks that illusion.
It tears it apart.
The evil in Halloween is not an external threat. It isn't a gang from the city coming to invade the suburbs. The evil is completely homegrown. Michael Myers is a product of this exact pristine environment. He grew up in a nice house on a nice street.
He is the literal boy next door. The danger didn't breach the walls. It was born inside the house.
And look at how the adult figures are portrayed in the film, or rather, how they aren't portrayed.
The parents are entirely absent.
Right. The teenagers are being systematically stalked and slaughtered inside their supposedly impenetrable, secure homes, and not a single parent calls to check in. The adults have completely abdicated their protective responsibilities because they placed blind faith in the illusion of suburban safety.
The call is coming from inside the zip code.
Yeah.
And the way the film frames this homegrown suburban evil is almost biblical. We have to bring up Dr. Loomis's famous monologue.
Oh, it's so good.
Donald Pleasance delivers this speech midway through the film that completely defines the tone of the entire franchise.
He is standing with the local sheriff trying to convince him that they aren't dealing with a standard criminal, and he delivers this chilling assessment of his patient.
How does it go?
He says, "I met this 6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face, and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes. I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil."
It's an incredible piece of writing. It strips away any attempt to psychoanalyze the killer. He isn't the product of a broken home. He is just a void.
Yes.
But that specific description of the devil's eyes wasn't just a dramatic flourish by Carpenter. It was based on a deeply unsettling real-life encounter, wasn't it?
It was. When Carpenter was a college student in Kentucky, he was enrolled in a psychology class that took a field trip to a local psychiatric institution. As part of the tour, they visited a ward dedicated to the most severe, intractable cases of mental illness.
And what did he see in that ward?
He saw a young adolescent boy who possessed what Carpenter later described as a schizophrenic stare. He recalled looking at this boy's completely blank, pale, emotionless face and feeling a profound chill as the boy looked back at him with absolute, unfathomable emptiness.
That's terrifying.
Carpenter noted that the look terrified him on such a primal level that he never forgot it. Years later, he lifted that exact real-world encounter and mapped it directly onto the fictional origin of Michael Myers.
He took the most unnerving real-world experience he ever had and weaponized it for the screen.
Yeah.
And clearly, the weapon worked. The public and the critics were forced to grapple with this terrifying, blank, suburban nightmare.
Yes, they were.
Which brings us to the aftermath. We need to look at the reception, the censorship, and the massive, sometimes bizarre legacy it left behind.
Let's start with the raw financial metrics because they are staggering by any metric of the film industry.
Lay it on us.
The film opened in October 1978. Remember, it was made for $300,000, largely shot in a few weeks with unknown actors and a cheap mask. It went on to gross $47 million at the domestic box office and pulled in another $23 million internationally.
So a worldwide theatrical gross of $70 million. And our sources clarify that if you adjust that figure for inflation, we're looking at the equivalent of $346 million today.
It instantly became one of the most profitable independent films in the entire history of cinema. It sold over 20 million tickets during its initial run.
Which is incredible.
And it wasn't driven by a massive studio marketing campaign. It was a pure grassroots word-of-mouth juggernaut. People were daring each other to go see it.
But the critical establishment wasn't entirely on board right out of the gate, were they? It wasn't universally hailed as a masterpiece on day one.
Far from it. You had absolute titans of film criticism completely at war over its value. On one side, you had Pauline Kael writing for The New Yorker.
She was a legend.
She was perhaps the most influential critic of her era, and she penned a notoriously scathing review. She essentially dismissed the entire project as derivative, arguing that Carpenter was just poorly mimicking the suspense techniques of Alfred Hitchcock and Brian De Palma.
Wow.
She summed it up by calling it dumb stariness that only satisfied audiences in a basic, childish way.
And dumb scariness. That is a devastatingly condescending dismissal from someone with Kael's authority. But then, on the other end of the spectrum, you have Roger Ebert.
Ebert is a fascinating case study here because he was famously aggressively critical of the hyper-violent slasher films that dominated the 1980s, but he championed Halloween.
Really?
He recognized the technical craft behind the scare. He called it a truly visceral experience. He wrote, "We aren't seeing the movie, we're having it happen to us." He was so impressed by the mechanical precision of the suspense that he placed it on his official list of the top 10 films of 1978.
I suppose the line between a visceral masterpiece and dumb scariness is entirely dependent on whether you appreciate the mechanics of a thrill ride. But regardless of the critical debate, the financial success was undeniable.
Undeniable.
It was so successful that in 1980, the NBC television network stepped in and bought the broadcast rights for $3 million. That means NBC paid 10 times the entire production budget of the movie just for the right to show it on television a single time.
However, broadcasting a visceral horror movie on primetime network television in 1980 presented a massive logistical hurdle.
Oh, the censors.
The Standards and Practices Department,
Yeah.
the television censors. They reviewed the film and demanded that several scenes of violence and intense suspense be severely trimmed or cut entirely before it could be broadcast into living rooms.
But that creates a massive structural problem.
Yeah.
If you cut out several minutes of suspense and violence from an already short 91-minute movie, you no longer have enough runtime to fill a standard 2-hour television broadcast slot with commercials.
You end up with dead air.
Exactly. How did they solve that?
They had to artificially inflate the runtime. Carpenter actually agreed to go back to work. While he was actively in production on the sequel, Halloween the 2nd, he took his crew and shot 12 minutes of entirely new footage specifically designed to act as filler for the NBC broadcast of the original film.
Wait, he shot brand new scenes for a movie years after it came out just to appease TV censors.
Yeah.
What on earth did he film?
The new scenes were almost entirely expositional, designed to pad the runtime without adding new violence. They filmed sequences showing more of Dr. Loomis interacting with a young Michael Myers at the Smiths Grove Sanitarium.
Okay, so more backstory.
Right. There was a scene of Loomis at a medical board review, desperately arguing that Michael needs to be locked up forever. There was another scene showing Loomis examining Michael's empty cell after the escape, discovering the word sister carved into the wooden door, which aggressively foreshadowed the plot of the sequel.
Okay, I see.
They also shot a mundane new scene with Jamie Lee Curtis's character, Laurie, asking to borrow a silk blouse from her friend.
But Jamie Lee Curtis had aged, and she had a totally different hairstyle by the time they shot the sequel.
She did. Her hair was significantly shorter. So, to maintain visual continuity with footage shot years earlier, they literally had to film the new scene with Curtis hiding her new haircut under a bath towel, pretending she had just stepped out of the shower.
That is the most absurd, scrappy piece of Hollywood trivia. Hiding your lead actress under a bath towel to appease network television censors so you can fill a commercial break.
It's hilarious.
But while NBC was busy censoring the original film, the rest of the film industry was busy ruthlessly copying it. Halloween essentially served as the architectural blueprint for the entire slasher boom that dominated the 1980s.
That is its most enduring, defining legacy. As horror scholars like Adam Rockoff have noted, Halloween wasn't the very first slasher film. We already discussed Black Christmas, and Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre predates it as well.
True.
But Halloween was the film that codified the tropes. It refined a disparate set of ideas into a highly replicable, highly profitable formula.
Let's break down the specific ingredients of that formula that Hollywood spent the next decade copying.
First, the gimmick of centering the violence around a specific holiday, date, or event like Valentine's Day, prom night, or Friday the 13th.
Right.
Second, the structural reliance on the final girl who survives the carnage to face the killer. Third, giving the killer a highly recognizable signature musical theme.
Check, check, check.
Fourth, the heavy reliance on the subjective first-person POV camera to force audience implication. And finally, the thematic through line of punishing teenage vices.
A whole checklist.
Almost every major horror franchise that followed Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street, and even the self-aware meta-slashers of the 90s like Scream owes its foundational DNA to the mechanics established by Halloween. Rockoff accurately calls it the gold standard model against which all subsequent slasher films are judged.
So what does this all mean? Here is where we have to look at the dark side of that massive success. Because capitalism didn't just spawn copycat movies from other studios. The commodification of the Halloween franchise itself got incredibly bizarre.
Oh, definitely.
When a movie becomes a brand, the merchandising often entirely loses the plot of the original art. Our sources mentioned a novelization that came out shortly after the film.
Yes, in 1979, a mass-market paperback novelization was published, credited to a pseudonym, Curtis Richards. And what makes it so fascinating to scholars today is that it completely, fundamentally contradicts the philosophical core of the movie it is supposed to be adapting.
In what way?
The genius of the film, as we discussed, is the blankness. the lack of motive. But the novelization attempts to explain everything. It adds exhaustive backstory detailing the ancient supernatural origins of the curse of Samhain, tying it to deformed Celtic teenagers.
Uh,
But far more egregiously, during the chapters set in the sanitarium, the novel features Michael Myers actually speaking out loud to the staff.
but that ruins everything. Dr. Loomis's entire terrifying thesis in the film revolves around the fact that Michael hasn't spoken a single word in 15 years. The silence is what makes him a monster rather than a man.
Exactly. The novelization strips away the mystique by trying to rationalize the irrational. And the bizarre merchandising didn't stop at paperbacks. In 1983, a company called Wizard Video released an official Halloween video game for the Atari 2600 console.
Oh man, the Atari 2600, the pinnacle of 8-bit technology. I'm trying to imagine how you translate psychological dread and Steadicam foregrounding into a system that can barely render a square.
You really can't. The game is essentially just blocky, pixelated sprites running back and forth across the screen. You control a babysitter trying to lead children to safe rooms while avoiding a killer who wields a pixelated knife.
Incredible.
Due to licensing issues, none of the characters are legally named in the manual, and the production of the game was so cheap, so incredibly low budget, that the physical game cartridges often didn't even have a printed label.
Wait, really?
They shipped with a piece of white tape stuck to the plastic, with the word Halloween hastily written on it in black marker.
A piece of tape and a Sharpie. Honestly, that feels like the most fittingly scrappy, low-budget tie-in possible for a franchise that started with a $1.98 costume mask. But there is a detail about that Atari game that I think perfectly encapsulates the trajectory of the entire horror genre in the 1980s.
You're referring to the death animation in the game.
Yes. Because while the original 1978 film is famously restrained, it relies almost entirely on shadows, tension, and a pulsing piano score, showing virtually no on-screen blood. The Atari game takes a completely different route.
It really does.
When your character is caught by the killer in the game, her pixelated head completely disappears and is replaced by this geyser of bright red pixels pulsating from her neck as she runs around headless.
Which was incredibly graphic and shocking for an Atari game at the time. And you are absolutely right. It perfectly illustrates the tragic irony of the film's legacy.
How so?
The original Halloween was an exercise in extreme psychological restraint. Critics praised it for being almost entirely bloodless. Yet, the massive financial success of that restrained film accidentally birthed a 1980s slasher industry that completely abandoned psychology in favor of extreme sadism, heavy gore, and what many cultural critics accurately condemned as deeply misogynistic violence.
It's like Carpenter built this perfectly tuned, subtle, high-performance sports car, and Hollywood looked at it, stripped the engine out, and used it to build a fleet of loud, ugly monster trucks.
That's a great way to put it.
They copied the literal shape of the movie, a guy in a mask with a knife, but they completely lost the soul. Or, well, in Michael's case, the terrifying soullessness.
It forces us to ask a difficult question about art and commerce. Does the act of franchising inherently ruin the mystique of an original masterpiece?
It's a tough question.
By authorizing novelizations that explain the backstory, by approving video games that prioritize gore over tension, by churning out sequel after sequel that desperately try to explain why Michael Myers is evil, the industry slowly chipped away at the very thing that made him terrifying in 1978, the terrifying reality of the unknown.
The blank canvas gets painted over again and again with cheap paint until it's just a muddy, incomprehensible mess. And that brings us to the end of our journey today. We started with Irwin Yablans wanting to make a cultural splash, and John Carpenter taking a massive gamble for $10,000 and creative control.
We dissected how a minuscule $300,000 budget and a cheap William Shatner mask forced a tiny crew into a state of profound, unprecedented creative improvisation.
We saw how 10 days of writing, 3 days of banging out an asymmetrical 54-time signature on a synthesizer, and the innovative use of the Panaglide camera turned the audience into voyeuristic predators.
And in doing so, they accidentally captured the latent cultural anxieties of white flight, suburban decay, and teenage rebellion.
And ultimately, they birthed an entire cinematic subgenre that changed the trajectory and the financial model of horror filmmaking forever.
It truly is a miracle of independent art.
It really is. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final, broader thought to chew on, based on everything we've unpacked about the psychology of this film today.
Consider the long historical evolution of our cultural monsters. If you look at horror cinema and literature before 1978, the monsters that scared us were largely supernatural, exotic, or distant.
Right.
You had ancient vampires living in Gothic European castles. You had cursed werewolves roaming foggy, remote moors. You had giant radioactive lizards attacking foreign cities. The threat was always the fantastical other, far removed from the safety of our daily lives.
You essentially had to seek out the danger. You had to climb a mountain to a castle, or be terribly unlucky in a dark foreign forest.
But Halloween suggested something far more insidious and far more terrifying. It suggested that the ultimate monster isn't a creature of ancient folklore, it's just a shape. A guy in mechanic's coveralls, standing completely silently in your own manicured middle-class suburban backyard. He is looking back at you through a blank, featureless mask, standing right next to the hedges you just trimmed on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. What does it say about the trajectory of our modern society and the deep underlying anxieties of our culture that our most enduring, iconic nightmare is no longer the fantastical other, but the absolute emotionless emptiness standing right in the middle of the familiar?
The scariest thing in the world isn't the monster hiding under the bed in a haunted house. It's the sudden, chilling realization that the deadbolt on your own front door doesn't matter at all. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking under the hood of the media you consume. Keep questioning how art reflects our anxieties. And maybe, well, double-check the locks tonight. We'll catch you next time.